So, today we want to start actually talking about ways that we can solve quadratic equations and get exact answers. Now, we learned how to solve the other day. We learned that solution was interchangeable with zeros and x-intercept. And that's great when we can use our calculator to find our x-intercept, but we can only get an approximation. And we need a way to find exact answers. So let's talk first about a couple of basics, and let's talk about what is a quadratic equation. You need to remember that a quadratic equation is the function, it is a function that contains a polynomial of degree 2. Contains a polynomial of degree 2. Now, degree 2 means that it is to the second power. The highest exponent is the second power. So it might have an x in it too, but what's really key is that the highest exponent is 2. So it's a function that contains a polynomial of degree 2. So of these, let's identify which ones are quadratic equations. When I look at this one, I'm like, yep, it's got an x squared. But the problem is, this one's got an x cubed in it too. We want the highest degree, the highest exponent to be 2. So no, this is not a quadratic equation. When I look at this one, I'm like, oh, there's my x squared. That's an x, so that's the highest exponent? Yes. This is a quadratic equation. Here I've got x, no x squared. This one's linear. And in fact, that first one that's not quadratic, it's cubic. It's to the third power. The fourth one, I've got x squared, nothing higher. So, yep, it is a quadratic. Now, it is important to note when we start trying to solve these things that we understand how many solutions a quadratic equation can have. Quadratics have 2 solutions. Always. Always, 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 always. Must have 2 solutions. Now, let's think back to our graphs the other day. We said that the solutions are the x-intercepts. And we said there were 3 ways that the parabola could interact with the x-axis. It could cross it 2 times. And this would be 2 real solutions. It could be that it's one of those problems where the parabola has the vertex on the x-axis. And so this is one repeated solution, because here's the deal. Quadratics have to have 2 solutions. This just happens to be the case where it has the same solution twice. And we'll see some examples like that. And then the other case was if the parabola is up here and it doesn't touch the x-axis at all. And this is actually still 2 solutions, but it's 2 imaginary solutions. All right? So we always have 2 solutions, and I need you to realize that you need to always find 2 solutions. But it could be that they're 2 real ones, we could have 2 imaginary ones, or we could have the same solution twice. So we do always have 2 solutions. So please keep that in mind. Must have 2 solutions. So today we're going to discuss 2 ways to solve these types of equations. Each is used for a different situation. So situation number 1. When we have x squared and no x. X squared and no x. In other words, b is equal to 0. B is equal to 0. We have an x squared term, but there is no just plain old x. How do we solve it? So we're all about some steps. Again, Algebra 2 is all about process, all about steps. The first step is very similar to when we were doing absolute values. First, we have to isolate x squared. We have got to get the squared thing by itself. So whatever we have to add to both sides or divide both sides by, we've got to isolate x squared. Second, we'll take the square root of both sides. Because we know the opposite of squaring something is to take the square root. So, in this particular example, I've got to get x squared by itself. I want to isolate both sides. So I've got to isolate that x squared. I need to do the opposite, so I'm going to add 125 to both sides. So I add 125 to both sides. That'll cancel. 5x squared is equal to 125. Still not by itself. Don't take the square root until x squared is completely by itself. Isolate it. Now x squared is by itself. Now when I get to this point, I've got to take the square root. And I ask myself, squares and square roots cancel each other out. X is equal to what? The square root of 25. What is the square root of 25? 5. And this is where I have to get us to remember. We must get two solutions. When you take a square root, there are two numbers that when I square them, they give me 25. 5 squared does equal 25, but there's another number that when I square it, I get 25, and that is negative 5. When we take the square root, when we are solving quadratic equations, we have to get two solutions. So you need to realize that when you take the square root, there are two outcomes, the positive and the negative. So my two solutions for x are x is equal to plus or minus 5. And it is okay if you write it that way. I mean, if you want to write it out as 5 and negative 5, I would accept that as well. But if you're looking for a shorthand way to write it, you can write plus or minus 5. But there are two solutions. I need to get two solutions. So please make sure you keep that in mind when you're solving by taking the square root. Here's another example. All right, so we said our first step was to isolate. So let's do that. I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. All right, that'll cancel. I get 2x squared is equal to negative 8. And then I've still got to divide by 2. So now I've got that x squared is equal to negative 4. So step 2 was to take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. X and x squared will cancel out. And x is equal to, I need to get two answers. So I'm going to do plus or minus. But this is negative. Think back. We did complex numbers. Take the square root of a negative 4, it's going to be plus or minus 2i. Again, still had to get two answers, so I had to use plus or minus. Still two solutions. It's just this time it's two imaginary solutions. And so my solutions are plus or minus 2i. All right. Situation number 2 is if we have x squared and x. We have x squared and x. So b is not equal to 0. Talking about it being in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c. Okay, we have x squared and x. Okay, we want to make sure that we can solve this. Now, if it's got x squared and x, we can't solve by square roots. Done. We can't. And so the only one you can solve with square roots is when it's just x squared. First rule of quadratics, to solve a quadratic equation, we must make the equation equal 0. Pretty much every method that we're going to use this year, we must make the equation equal to 0. So please make sure you keep that in mind. That is always going to be our first step. So first step, get the equation equal to 0. So I'm going to do that. So our second situation here, and by the way, we're going to solve by factoring. There are going to be other methods for this situation as well. We'll talk about those on a different day. But today we're going to be talking about factoring. Get the equation equal to 0, though, for all of the methods. So for this whole situation, first step should always be get it equal to 0. In this problem, that means I need to subtract 15. Please make sure that you're aware we can't combine anything that isn't a like term. So the only thing I could subtract 15 from would be another number that had no x, another constant. So this is just going to be x squared plus 2x minus 15 is equal to 0. I've got to get that equal to 0. Once I've got it equal to 0, you'll notice that we have a trinomial here. And we just spent a whole day learning how to factor these. We reviewed how to factor these. So what we want to do is we want to factor the polynomial. So I'm going to look at this problem and say I need to factor that. So it's got a 1 here. I know it's going to factor to be x and x. Two numbers that multiply to equal negative 15 and add to equal 2. Negative 15. So 5 times negative 3. 5 times negative 3 would be negative 15. 5 plus negative 3 would be 2. So x plus 5 and x minus 3. So I factored the polynomial. Third step, set factors equal to 0. So I'm going to do x plus 5 equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, and then I'm going to solve for x. Again, I need to get two answers. Look at this. Subtract 5 from both sides, x equals -5. Add 3 to both sides, x equals 3. I got two answers. Quadratics should get two answers. I got two answers.